So I am delighted to introduce our panel of guests. Dr. Bertold Ulsama holds a PhD in law and a degree in clinical psychology. He met Bert Hellinger in Family Constellations in 1994. He has later taken constellations to many countries, including USA, Argentina, Australia, India, South Africa, Russia, and China. And I first met Bertold in Cloisterburn-Reed in 2008 when he was teaching on the faculty. He's the author of 35 books, including 8 constellation works, and students of Spanda-Ochre constellation course are familiar especially with your book, The Art and Practice of Family Constellations. So welcome, Bertold. Barbara Morgan began as a gestalt therapist. Barbara met Bert Hellinger when he first came to London in 1996. And thereafter, she followed him to various countries learning this work. In 1997, she began running workshops and later on ran training and supervision. Barbara's remarkable contribution to family constellation was as editor of the Knowing Field from 2004 for 18 years. This was the only international constellation journal giving access and space of meeting for constellators around the world. Barbara, I met Barbara again in Cloisterburn-Reed almost every year that we went, and Barbara would be there, of course, as faculty and also bringing the ISCA publications. Barbara has also birthed 3 books, Coming Home, A First Step into the World of Family Constellation, Reflections on Motherhood, Volume 1, Birth, and Volume 2, A Different Path for the Soul. Welcome, Barbara. Susie Tucker. Susie needs no further introduction, I think. Susie, such a wonderful keynote, I think will remain with us for a long, long time. And so we're so happy that you are here with us today. And you know, I was just delighted when you said I'm delighted to be here in service, and we were deeply touched by your email. Thank you. Dr. Sebastian Green is Emeritus Professor of Management at University College Cork, Ireland, and he provides executive coaching to senior business managers and leaders and teaches systemic psychodynamic coaching, applying the work of Bert Hellinger to coaching and business and business consultancy. And Sebastian has been part of Bert Hellinger's intensive trainings in Pickel, Austria, London, Bad Reichenhall. And he's the co-founder of Ochre Ireland along with Colette Green. Dr. Sebastian has been closely involved in the setting up of the Spanda-Ochre work in India and continues to support and guide the training. I remember very well our first meeting in 2007 in the garage of Spanda Foundation, Sebastian. Thank you and welcome today.
Hello, everybody.
Colette Green, fifth panelist, is a psychotherapist and organizational consultant, and she trained with Bert at Pickel, Austria, Bad Reichenhall, Germany, besides other intensive training. She has a great love of horses and nature and is a certified equine-assisted psychotherapist with IGALA, USA. In 2008, Bert asked Colette to organize an intensive in London, which she did. It was a great success. I've seen videos of this conference, and what particularly touched me was Bert's teaching on mother and mothers in the service of life. What few people know is that Colette's affair with India began when she was in her teens, and she had visited India ever since. She was the first to bring constellations to India, and in those initial days, she would open constellations for groups in people's houses, under the trees, in training centers, and for Sailaja and me, even in a garage. So welcome, Colette. So my first question really to the panel is, and I'm just so honored that you are all here today, is because each of you, bring in the part that has been close to Bert. And there are stories, there are aspects of that we are not even aware about. Like you just said, Susie, there were things that we were never aware about. So from videos that I have watched of Bert's initial work, and I was so touched by his work even then, and there's something that drawn me into that work. But it is different in those initial videos to what we experience later, the movements of the soul, the movements of the spirit mind. And you've had contact with Bert Hellinger and family constellations in your own unique way. We would love to hear about those times, to share a little bit about your personal and professional anecdotes, which may also throw light in the early years of development of family constellation.
Okay, at one hand, there is so much I could share, because I don't know Bert from his earlier times. There were times where he was not yet famous in Germany, and there were a group around him, and he was a therapist, and there were Gunther Weber or Jakob Schneider, Albrecht Mahr, and this were the beginning. And then in Germany came his first book, which Gunther Weber published, Love's Hidden Symmetry. And this brought an enormous interest for the work in Germany. And I came through this book to his work because a friend recommended it to me, and I looked at it and I found it so deep. And I had done a lot of therapy for myself, but I had in many directions, Gestalt and primal and everything, but I had avoided always family therapy. And when I didn't want to touch. And when I read this book, I was just really pulled in. And I had been in India before and had known some wise man, and I said, Bert Hellinger is the wisest man in Germany I know. When I read this book, there was such a wisdom in this book. And then I had the first workshop, 94, where I came, was about organizational constellations. And there were only 30 managers and consultants, and he showed his work for organizations. And on the second day, there was a man, and he said, I cannot resist to do it. I must set up you and your father. Because before I wanted only touch organizational business topics. And then he set up this man and the father. And this was, to me, and I became aware of my difficult relationship with my father. So that was really where I wanted to come much closer to the work. So this is the beginning. And maybe something And then there came the big movement, the big wave where 300, 400, 500 people came to a workshop of Hellinger. I organized one in Freiburg, my city, with 700 people in 98. So many people. And I came closer to Bert by writing in a way. I wrote an introductory book. It's this healing power of the past. It's still in Germany, they spread it still, so it's nice. And I wanted to translate his language in a language which I can understand. So I tried to do it, and I wrote it, and then I said, I don't know if I'm right, because I now express it with my words, but maybe I'm wrong. So I asked him if he would be ready to read it. And then he invited me into his house. And there he was still living with his first wife, Herta. And in 2 days, I read it loud and he was listening to it. And I had no comments, so it was fine. And what was so impressive for me, his wife Herta made the meal, so we had lunch and dinner. And breakfast, that was Bert's task. So this was clear. He always made the breakfast. And at first I was, oh my God, Bert is bringing the breakfast. So that he was so grounded in a way, so human. So I don't know if my time is over. I give over to Barbara.
Yeah. Barbara?
Yes, hello.
Hello. Would you say, yeah, a little about the topic we were on?
I will. Yes. Will you tell me when it's time, or do I just have to time myself?
Either way, would you like us to tell you? Maybe
Yes,
Prince, you
please.
can just say with about 5 minutes.
Thank you. Yes. Otherwise, I know I could go on all day, so I don't want to do that.
Yes.
Firstly, thank you very much for inviting me, Annie and Colette. And I was very touched at the beginning when you lit the candle, because it felt so honouring of Bert and that heart space I've always felt with him. And when I first met Bert, it was when he first came to London in 1996. And I was in the audience, and there were about a dozen people on the stage. And as I walked in, I was quite close to the front, but I remember thinking, oh gosh, is this going to be a bit boring? I'm going to be watching this theatre and I'm not going to be involved in anything. And then you can call it fortune, or you can call it the field operating. I was chosen to be representative in the second constellation. And I was completely gripped from that moment. And when I came away from those 3 days, which were so special to me, I wrote to Bert immediately and I said, there's no training around. How can I get to do this work? And what he wrote back was just 2 lines. All you need is to be at peace with your parents. And that for me was so profound, seemed so simple, and actually is a lifetime's journey I've since discovered for myself and for many other people as well. So that was my first contact. And then I personally worked with him twice. And I remember looking into his eyes and thinking, there's no kidding this man. There's such depth. I never felt so safe as when I sat next to him in that way. And both pieces of work were very profound. And then I took a supervision case to him of a woman who I'd worked with as a Gestalt therapist for 7 years, who was alcoholic, £20,000 in debt, being constantly sexually and physically abused by her father every day of her life, and she was 27. And she came to me twice a week for those 7 years and paid £5 a time. And I took this case to Bert as a supervision case, and he just selected her mother and father, and they stood both wearing black, interestingly, facing opposite directions, and they fell to the ground. And when I came back from that, this client, who had given her permission for me to take that to supervision, had left the family home, had found herself a council flat, had been to the Citizens Advice Bureau to get advice on her debt, and was in a flat and got herself a job as a gardener, and eventually even had a relationship with a man. So it was an amazing transformation for me. My other contact with Bert was obviously through the journal, and issue 12, I interviewed him. And that was at the height of all the difficulties that were around. And I said to him something like, how do you want to be remembered after you die? And he said something like, I don't care, or I don't. And in terms of the split that had happened in the community at that point, I asked him to comment, and he just said, they go their way and I go mine, and they go with my blessing. So that wisdom came through again. It was profound. And with the journal, I wrote to him each time and I said, do you have something to contribute? And he was very gracious in his contact with me and sent me something each time. And then at a certain point, I can't remember what year it was, he said to me, you have my blessing to take any writing from anywhere, from anything that I've written. So that was also a very profound movement for me. He, in a way, gave me carte blanche to go through any of his written material and to publish it in the journal. So that was also really beautiful. When I was at one of his works, I followed him around to Greece and Holland and Poland and various other places. And I was at one of his workshops, and I remember him saying, some of you may think that you can go away from here and do this work yourselves. And then he had one of his very typical long silences. And then he said, I welcome it, but please remember we are calves before we are cows. And I've never forgotten that. And another profound thing was when we were struggling in England, there were exclusions and difficulties, competition, all sorts of stuff. And I wrote to him and I said, next time you come to London, would you be willing to do a constellation for those of us who are struggling? And his reply was, strife and division are necessary and inevitable. My advice to you is not to comment upon the activities of others and not to allow other people's comments to affect your own activities. That way you'll have peace in everything that you do. As I work in this way too, I do not propose to comment on your request. So it's so interesting that I've remembered these gems from Bert, you know, and again, I don't remember which workshop I was at. I was frantically making notes along with all kinds of other people. And he just smiled and said, why are you making notes? You'll remember what you need to. And that's so true, because these things that I remember were when it spoke to my soul. It was nothing to do with what I hardly read my notes that I wrote down. It was more what really went through into my heart. And that's what I retained. And that's what I, if you like, regurgitate for people, because for me, there's deep, deep, deep wisdom in what Bert was sharing and in what he did. So he's very dear to my heart. And, you know, I have some dear friends. We've connected in a way through Bert. Colette and Sebastian are dear friends. I see Lemke is here. Lemke has really honored Bert in so many ways, and Maria. So some dear friends are here. And Annie, I remember meeting you in what was it, Bernreid or Zist? I can't remember. It was Bernreid, wasn't it?
Bernreid.
Yes. And Bertold, we kind of dipped in and out with each other, didn't we, at Bernreid and also at various conferences. So it's so lovely to see these familiar faces. And Susie, even though we haven't met, we've met in writing several times. So it was really lovely to see you as the keynote speaker. So thank you.
Sebastian.
You're on mute, Sebastian.
Okay, yes, it is. It's helpful to unmute oneself. Well, I'm really honoured and delighted and grateful to be here. And you know, as I hear, you know, all of you talk about Bert, you know, the very last thing, Barbara, when you said about his generosity, and and allowing people to take stuff. I remember having a conversation with Bert once when he said, and it was about the strife, he said, all I actually want is to be acknowledged. And to be here today, to be able to be connected with everyone, to do just that, to acknowledge, I think one of the wisest people, not just in Germany, but certainly that I have ever met. Susie mentioned many of the people from whom his work is derived. And I have no doubt that for me and for many, his work stands up there with all of them. And in fact, in the way he brings together and allows his wisdom to land in such a practical and reflective way, makes me feel really very privileged in this lifetime to have been able to sit at his feet and share some time with him. So I consider myself really very fortunate. And I don't know, I suppose, you know, I stumbled into this work, or possibly I was pushed actually, in 2000. And spent many years, I suppose, in a way, both trying to understand the work, because I think Bert's fearlessness, often in terms of addressing critical issues, but from such a different way, actually catalyzes a response in all of us when sometimes he says things and you think, my gosh, you know, that's difficult to understand. And so through writing, a bit like what Bertolt was saying, you know, I've also tried to understand some things. And I remember in the early days of Bert's work, people might sometimes have commented that you know, he would make interventions or would be perhaps a little abrasive. But then afterwards, people would acknowledge how right he had been. And in a way, I think that contribution for me has been really important. But perhaps at a personal level, I think I was very fortunate when Colette arranged the workshop in London at the Irish Centre, and a lot of people came over from Ireland, and I see some of them in the audience here today. You know, I got to drive Bert around, to pick him up, and then after the event, spend some time with him. Is we went for a glass of wine in the Spaniards Inn, a pub in North London, after the workshop. And at some point, I remember saying something about a member of the family who I was concerned about. And he just looked at me. And I can't remember what he said, but the sense was, you're being ridiculous, Sebastian. Just trust. It's not your business. Stay out. And he was so right. That I remember was he talked about his writing. And perhaps, given that that's something that I've sort of, you know, been so drawn to in his work, apart from also his demonstrations and how it can be used with families and organizations. But he said that he typically started writing very late at night, especially when Sophie had retired, and he would write into the early hours of the morning, and it would just be a constant sort of stream. He didn't have to think; it just came through him. And for somebody who's, you know, as an academic, I suppose I've struggled so much of my life with writing, but to hear somebody who has written such wonderful material, again, how privileged really to spend some time with, I come back to what Bertolt said, I think certainly the wisest person that I have met in my life. So thank you.
It's just amazing listening to everybody and listening to these different experiences of our relationships with Bert, both personal and professional. And I didn't know whether I'd start at the beginning or I'd start at the end, because the end is precious to me as well. But I'll start at the beginning. So constellation work came to Ireland with Breda Perham, with Carmel Hamill, and Derry Mohally, and they may be on the call. I think Breda had bumped into Hunter on a plane somewhere and brought this back. So they were psychotherapists and supervisors. So all their students suddenly, or their clients, became into this sphere of influence. And through that, I went to Würzburg, Sebastian and I went to Würzburg, we went to Zist, we went to Pichel, we went to Bad Reichenhall, and just our lives changed, or my life and my view of life changed so completely. I mean, I think initially, like even before meeting Bert, but when it was about experiencing the work, it was the inclusion. And it was the part of me that had been separated, the part of me that was missing, the part of me that was my father, that hadn't been allowed and there was no permission for. And suddenly this work opened up this wholeness where all of you could be, and your whole family and your whole ancestry, and just this concept of inclusion, and where that takes us, the legacy of the greater love and into the greater soul and all of that, that was what got me in the beginning. And it has actually proved to be just the most amazing influence on our lives, in our family, with our children, with our family of origin. So I don't know if we stumbled into it, because I know in the beginning I found it, sometimes I found it difficult and wondered, hey, maybe I need to just pull back from all of this. And then realizing, no, I need to open more. There is something so important here. So certainly my life has been utterly changed by the work, and by meeting Bert, by meeting him as well. When he opened the first international kind of training, if you like, at Bad Reichenhall, no, it was Pichel. It was Pichel, and we went. And at the end of it, he gave me a small piece of something to translate. So I took it home, and in my not so great German and English, but it was okay, I sent it back, and he said, yep, that's fine. He said, but look, I'm coming to London. He said, I've been invited to the University of London, have invited me to a symposium, and would you organize a workshop for me? And I was, very bowled over by the thought of it, because it's just way beyond anything I could even possibly perceive. And actually, I think there's someone there today, Eileen O'Brien, who Eileen and I were colleagues and great friends. And I rang Eileen and I said to her, you'll just never guess what's just happened. And I read the email to her and I said, of course it's a no. It's an absolute no. There's no possibility I could ever do anything like that. And Eileen said to me, she said, just take your time. Just take your time about this. And I took my time and I ended up being able to say yes. And I've been able to say yes to a lot of things through the influence of Bert Hellinger and the work that I never thought I'd be able to say yes to in my life. I think I've been taken beyond my perceived limitations very much, both with Bert and with the work. And organizing the London workshop was an incredible event. And what was most incredible about it was that it was personal. I said to him, now, who should I deal with in the office about this? Who will I? And he said, no, you deal with me directly. Just directly, whatever we talk about this all the way through. And if anything happens, I'm responsible. And if anything, whatever, you just keep talking to me about it and it will all happen in a beautiful way, in the way it's meant to happen. And it did. And I have to say that tonight or today, wherever you are in the world, is reminding me a little bit of his words after that workshop, which was, he said to me afterwards, he said it was a bit of a feast. And it was a bit of a feast. It was wonderful. And there's quite a few people here today who were there then as well. So it was very special. And my dealings with him were very kind. And I experienced his generosity that other people have spoken about in such a lovely way. And then carried on going to the various things that were going on. And then Bert got older and he got frailer. And we stayed in touch. And then, so I'll finish with the end bit then, which was that we knew he was coming close to the end. And I rang the office and they put me through to Sophie. And I said, Sophie, I'm just wondering how he is and how are you, how are things? And she said to me, just hold on a minute. And she took the phone and she brought it over to Bert and she said to him, it's Colette. You know, I don't know if he would possibly have remembered, but anyway, he said, oh, okay, good. And he said to me, I had this wonderful conversation. Sebastian was beside me, and he said to me, I'm so glad you rang. And the tears just started to come at that stage. He said, I'm so glad you rang. He said, I want you to know that I'm dying. And this is perfectly okay. This is exactly how it's meant to be. We will all die. You will die, all of us. This is exactly right. But I am in this stage now. And he said, and I want you to know that you have everything now. You have the teachings. You have all of them. And he said, and I want to tell you that I'm always with you. Such a blessing. Such a beautiful, beautiful blessing. And I hold it very dear and him very dear. And yeah. There are other things to say, but I'm not going to say any more than that he is always with me. And I think we pass that on to the people that we work with, Annie, as well, his presence. And thank you all for your presence here today. It's very precious.
I'll start with, because Berthold, you introduced the fathers, and then Barbara, you brought in the fathers. And I have a very, very strong memory, a tiny, huge thing. I quit smoking, right? And for me, like quitting smoking was a major achievement. I really talk about a change of life. And the way that I quit smoking, or if I trace it back, it is a moment on 8th Avenue during a pause in one of Bert's workshops on the way to Starbucks to get him a black coffee and to get me a black coffee. And I thought to myself, well, if I'm going to be spending time with this man, I'm so sorry, I need to smoke. I can't, right? So I reached in my pocket and I pulled out a cigarette and I lit my cigarette and I kind of looked at him and he looked at me and, you know, in his Bertish way, he said, when you take, he actually used this word, when you take a drag, think of your father. Again, didn't quite understand what he meant in that moment, maybe was even a little bit irritated. Over time, I think as I was able to sort of integrate, I was not used to thinking about my father at all. The need to smoke, I have to say, just the volume went way down until it became irrelevant. And what I sort of understood, aside from the piece about my father, although including him calmed my system down and disallowed from doing that and all of that. But I also understood that he actually looked at this bad thing I was doing as a resource, in a way, a part of me. He didn't judge it. He actually made a profound observation that allowed for me to be me, and then me to change over time in his presence. So it's a very big, tiny moment for me. I really want to bring in somebody, I just because when I look at the lineage of this work and people mention family constellations, movements of the soul, spirit mind. Harold Honan is the first person I worked with for years in New York. Harold was what I described as a pit bull. He blew open the doors and insisted that we come in. I really needed somebody like that. And the first workshops were videotaped by Harold, all the ones in New York City, up until the last one, I think. Videotaped by him. Harold did many interviews with Bert. And movements of the soul, my experience was there was a transition, and I would call it a segue. I never felt it as an abrupt change. I always thought it was like Bert, towards the end, became an abstract painter. And those of us who knew the work could turn the canvas over and see so much of the original material, but what was left with the gestures, the bold lines, the subtleties, and many of the words had disappeared beneath the ground. Anyway, so for me, Harold was very important in the United States. You know, the idea that Bert looked and said, in India, you already know this work. He looked at those of us in the United States and he basically said, in a way, the US is invested in forgetting. And in this sense, the work is very difficult in the United States. And I think that there was truth in it then, and I think there's truth in it now. Very invested in forgetting about the indigenous people, very invested in forgetting about building the country on the back of slaves, very invested in forgetting the Chinese, very invested in forgetting in general. So this work has perhaps a different path in the United States. For me, it's beautiful. It grows and it grows and it grows and it grows deeply. Doesn't feel so much flavor of the month. I don't know that it will ever be flavor of the month in the US. Although the Goop episode certainly helped. I don't know if anybody saw the Goop episode. But a family constellation was done on that. And then the Turkish movie or the Turkish series that also incorporated constellations. Of course, people get a very particular sense of that flavor. In the beginning, I hosted Bert in a place called Source of Life. It held maybe 100 people. And when Harold and I rented this space, I said, I don't care about anything except it must be quiet. There just has to be I mean, it's New York City, so quiet is a relative term. But it must be as quiet as possible. And they said, oh, yes, 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 yes. So Saturday, it was quiet. And Sunday, in the room that adjoined our room, a gospel choir came in to rehearse. Not only were they very loud, but because they were rehearsing, they kept singing the same thing over and over and over again. And at lunch, I was mortified. I'm sure that I was turned even paler than I am naturally. And at lunch, I apologized to Bert. And what he said to me was, it makes people lean closer. And after lunch, I actually noticed that everybody was sitting at the edge of their seat, totally tuned into this man, not so much blocking out the beautiful gospel music, but making sure that they could hear him. The second time I hosted him at a place called Covenant House in Manhattan, which is a nonprofit group that brings in runaways, particularly with AIDS, drug addiction, and cares for them and trains young people. There were young people there serving pastries. And by the way, they all sat down. You know, they're all serving pastries, and then they all sort of floated in and sat down and were sort of mesmerized. I was very nervous to bring Bert to this place. I had gone out the day before to all the thrift shops and found hangings and stuff to hang over the cracks in the bathroom. Anyway, it's what we could afford. It's what I could afford. And he walked in and he looked around and he said, it's wonderful. So my experience of Bert was really, this is kind of a cliche phrase, but this man walked the talk. And this was really a distinction between him and many other great teachers whom I've met, that congruence between who he was and what he taught was extraordinary. And when it wasn't there, he acknowledged it. When it wasn't there, he acknowledged it. He was easy with saying, I don't know, and I made a mistake. And it became a part of his wisdom.
So I have a question which perhaps just 2 lines. I know it's a big question, but if you can have it, if you can just say a couple of lines about this, which is, you know, what we remember and celebrate today, the legacy of greater love. And I know, Susie, in your keynote, you had spoken about it, you know, each word, the language of it. So my question is, in your perspective, how do you see it emerging and unfolding? And the very difficult task of just 2-3 sentences. So we just have like a minute or so. Yeah. So maybe begin now from Sebastian. Is that okay?
Okay, well, for me, it's because I work within the organizational domain, I can only see how the work unfolds there. And all I would say is that management and organization is very driven by recipes and painting by numbers. And I think that while people talk about the importance of seeing below the surface and what's out of awareness and what we don't know about, Bert's work, I think, allows that to be foregrounded. And I see that whatever resistance there is in organizations to embracing the work, working with the trainers, working with the consultants or the coaches for them to better be able to see below the surface is how my hope is that the work will land more effectively within the organizational domain.
Thank you, Sebastian. And maybe go the other way now. Well, Colette, Susie, Barbara, and then Bertold.
Thanks, Annie. I remember at Pickle, Bert set up a constellation. And there were two sides to the room, and he asked for a representative from here and a representative from there. Actually, he didn't. That's incorrect. He said, "Where is the work going?" And what happened is that someone from either side came out. They held hands and they walked forward. And he said, something totally new will evolve. It will evolve. It will grow in its own way. And for me, I don't have any prediction for how the work will go, because I think it's being guided by a creative force, and we'll see.
Thank you, Colette. Susie?
Ditto. I think both those things, and the word for me that comes up always is it's a movement without a specific destination, and that we can't actually predict, nor do I care to try, the impact of continuing confluence. So the word confluence is very important, I think.
Thank you, Susie. Barbara?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I notice in myself what I'm trying to do is influence how it emerges. And so I haven't got the sophistication that Bert had to just be able to let the work go and evolve in its own way. I'm still hammering away at trying to maintain some of the essence of what I think Bert was about. So I don't know what's going to happen. But one of the things I kind of insist on are the systemic approach as opposed to the individualistic approach. So people asking me, can I be an issue holder? Can I pay more and be an issue holder? And I say, I don't work that way. I work systemically with what's emerging in the moment. So it's a kind of paradox in a way. You know, I'm wanting to preserve the very thing that Bert was able to let go of, you know, preserve the letting go. It's a contradiction in terms. But anyway, that's what I'm doing. And I just accept that that's where I am. I somehow am trying to hold on to that essence of non-individualism, systemic, looking at the field, the bigger picture. And I haven't let it go yet.
Yeah, thank you for reminding us of that, Barbara, because I think, I mean, I know I certainly am there where you're saying, and thank you for that. Yeah. Bertold?
Yeah, I see how constellation work is spreading in many ways, and I'm glad about it, but I'm not so engaged in it. Well, my engagement when I hear about the greater love is, can I find it in myself when I'm working? So this is, I remember saying of Bert, he said, if you really come to love, this is painful. So it's not that love is something where you just you are happy. So if you go through this, to come to this ground, you must go through a lot of pain, or maybe even meeting it is painful. So I try, and it's happening. It's nothing what I can do, but this is my idea, that I want to, that this love goes deeper and there comes more acceptance of everything with this love. And this is what I'm engaged in a way.
Yeah, And I just went, when you said it was painful, I went, and absolutely, it's not an easy path.
This is for everybody. The question is from Sonja. She asks, my question is how to deal with competition between constellation facilitators or systemic workers. I'm encountering it outside between others, and I can also feel it within myself. It saddens me because there is enough for all of us to do.
Yeah. When I do my trainings, I, in a way, try to flush out as much competitiveness as I can. And so when people are meeting in smaller groups, they have a small support group and they have a practice group, I suggest that they speak their truth in terms of who they feel competitive with. So it's a kind of addressed all the way through the training. And then eventually, if they allow that competitiveness, then they become supportive. So it's like allowing the shadow side as early as possible in the groupings, and then when they come out the training the other end, the hope is that by naming the competitiveness, then the support comes automatically. So it's kind of allowing both polarities speaking their truths.
Yeah.
No, it's just spontaneously when I heard Barbara, I often use the sentences about similarity. And when I see the both which are competitive, I could say, I want to be the best and you want to be the best. We are similar. And this may relax. And when I heard it first, I saw a little child which wants to be the best because the little child wants to be loved. So, and if a child feels loved, it needs no competition. Maybe even competition between the siblings. I have siblings, so I know. So it's really when I can feel to be loved by my mother, my father deeply, then competition may vanish in a way.
I think there is, it's funny, Barbara, I'm thinking that I don't think I ever address it directly, but now perhaps I will. There is a way in which I think it's an orientation, right? The idea that there isn't enough to go around, right, is a backdrop of something. It is actually not in front. It's not oriented toward the future. It's quite, trying to pull the past forward. So I think I talk a lot about orientation and a lot about stance. Creativity has room for us all. It's what it means, right? Structures don't. So I talk about stance and orientation.
I don't think I really have anything to
Okay.
add apart from saying that whatever emerges, that's something that one can work with. And yeah, we're all in the same boat.
Yeah, I think I feel the same way in relation to mother and wanting to be loved and needing to be seen, and that would be the route I would take. Yeah, and enough, that there is enough, even outside of trainings, in situations where I can remember people coming to work in Ireland and someone saying, how do you feel about that? I said, there's enough, of course, it's fine. So I think enough is an important word. Yeah, thank you.
This question is from Anil Grover. How are you applying Bird's legacy of greater love in the contemporary context of geopolitical conflicts and climate change?
I'll just say something very simple, because I have a simple response, like visceral response to what is a great complexity. The first thing is that I am with, not against. And so I'm trying to be with movements, not against them. And I see myself as basically planting seeds. And anything that draws me away from the planting of seeds is a distraction. And it draws me away from creativity. And I see it very much with the Mideast right now, all over my Facebook. There are these digital soldiers. And we are being swept up into something. And that takes me away from planting seeds.
I think for me, there are two things. One is, I think it was Bert's second book, Acknowledging What Is, just having to accept the bigger picture without really knowing what's happening in the world. It's, for me, it's going crazy, the bigger picture, but somehow we just have to accept it. So that's one thing. But in regards to the Middle East, I quote a story from one of the conferences I was at, Albrecht Mars conferences. I don't know if you were there, Colette or Bertold, where Bert was asked by two people who were forming a reconciliation institute in the Middle East, an Israeli and a Palestinian. They asked him to come and run a workshop, a constellation for their institute. And I found myself in this tiny room, much too small for the number of people that were wanting to go to this constellation. And I was sitting at the back, and there were glass doors behind me. So this is the personal part of it. And there were a crowd of Germans behind the glass doors trying to get in. And they broke the lock in the end, and they stepped over me and stood up in front of me so I couldn't see. And I felt murderous rage coming through me. And then I realized, oh, I'm in a field of victims and perpetrators. And here I am as an English person with the crowd of Germans who've just stepped over me. So once I realized that, my rage completely disappeared. But then what Bert set up was so profound, it overrode all that personal stuff. He chose a line of German men to represent the Jews. And then he chose a line of men to represent the Palestinians. And they stood opposite each other in silence for a long time. Nothing moved. And then he put a woman behind each of the men. And he said, these are the mothers. And the mothers started yelling and sobbing and saying, this is my son. He's no different to your son. And eventually, most of these men just fell to the ground, and on the ground, victim and perpetrator embraced. I mean, for me, that was a profound happening that I had the privilege to witness. So that's what I'm quoting to people.
Yes, I think we have to move to a different place, away from personalities and into a soul level, to be able to look at these things. And it is only there that we will find, in that roomy field, which is beyond judgment, which is somewhere where we are all connected, living, dead, the future, the past. At the level of personality, it's very difficult to find reconciliation. I think I found that from.
So there is a danger in when you start to do family constellation, I see, because you think you can now save the world in a way. When I saw it when there was a 9/11, when there were the Twin Towers in New York breaking down. So many, I would say, like crazy constellations happened where people wanted to heal something and to find something and to find the truth and to do something to heal the world, to save the world. And my opinion is the world is so big. And the right movement, what I learned from constellation work, is the biggest movement, the biggest thing in constellations for me is this bow. And there is this, what is happening right now, and then the only thing I can do is just to bow before it. And the sentence which is still helpful is, I don't need to understand it. I don't need to understand. It's so much bigger. So the only thing is I can do is bow.
I know I spoke, but I just want to bring up one other book, right? But sort of piggybacking, which is Peace Begins in the Soul.